what does it truly mean to be alive? I mean, how do we even begin to classify life, understand its purpose, maybe even define ourselves within this, this incredibly vast, intricate tapestry of the natural world?
Yeah, those are the big ones. For centuries, these were questions mainly for philosophers.
Right.
But more and more, biology is stepping up, providing some really profound and sometimes, frankly, quite eye-opening answers.
And that's exactly where we're headed today, isn't it?
Precisely. We're embarking on a deep dive into this really fascinating field called the philosophy of biology.
Okay.
It's where the most compelling scientific discoveries about life intersect with deep philosophical questions. And it uncovers some surprising insights, challenges assumptions we've held for a long time about, well, pretty much everything.
Our guide for this journey is an insightful book, Philosophy of Biology, a very short introduction by Samir Okasha. It's concise but incredibly rich, really unpacks some of the biggest, maybe the trickiest conceptual questions right at the heart of modern biology.
Absolutely. And our mission for you today is basically to give you a shortcut, a way to really grasp the most important nuggets of knowledge, the key insights from this field.
So we'll distill how biology wrestles with these huge questions, right? From what a gene really is to the definition of a species, and even touching on what it means to be human.
Get ready for some potentially transformative moments, those aha insights that might just reframe how you see the entire living world around you.
Okay, so let's start maybe with a fundamental question. Why do we even need a philosophy of biology? I mean, haven't philosophy and the natural sciences always been kind of intertwined?
They absolutely have. You think about philosophers like Kant or Hume, they were definitely influenced by the science of their day.
And figures like Descartes or Leibniz actually did science themselves, made significant contributions.
That's right. For centuries, philosophers tackled these grand questions of the universe, our place in it, how we know things. But as modern science really took off, 17th, 18th century.
Things changed.
Right. A lot of questions that were traditionally philosophical. Is matter made of atoms? Is the mind non-physical? Science started providing answers, or at least you couldn't ignore the science anymore.
And that led to something new.
Yeah, this whole new field, the philosophy of science. Not doing science, but doing philosophy about science, asking questions like, can you ever truly prove a theory?
Or, if you have two theories that both fit the data, how do you choose?
Exactly. Questions about the scientific process itself. Not typically what scientists ask while doing an experiment, but fundamental to understanding it.
Which brings us then to the philosophy of biology, a sub-branch that really got going when the 70s.
Around then, yeah. And there were really three key reasons for it taking off. First, philosophy of science had been, very focused on physics. Biology was kind of left out. Second, complex conceptual puzzles started popping up within biology itself, grabbing philosophers' attention. And third, there was this broader naturalistic turn in philosophy. Generally, philosophers looking to science, especially biology, for answers to age-old philosophical problems.
Okay, let's unpack that physics-centric bias. So for a long time, philosophers saw physics as the model, the gold standard.
Pretty much. Early to mid-20th century philosophy of science, like logical empiricism, really used physics as its template. They were all about finding universal laws of nature, like Newton's laws. Physics seemed full of them.
But biology, not so much. You open a biology textbook, you find facts, models, theories, but not really laws in that same physics sense.
Exactly. Biological information just isn't structured that way. And even critics of that old approach, like Thomas Kuhn, who talked about paradigm shifts.
Right. Copernicus, Einstein.
Yeah, even Kuhn largely ignored biology's huge revolutions, Darwin, germ theory, genetics. So a big reason philosophy of biology emerged was just to give biology its proper due in these philosophical discussions about science.
And then you mentioned conceptual issues within biology itself.
Right. The 20th century saw this explosion of biological progress.
Yeah.
You had the neo-Darwinian synthesis, merging evolution with genetics and paleontology, and then molecular biology, DNA structure, genomics, huge breakthroughs.
But these discoveries brought puzzles with them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Philosophical puzzles baked right into the science. Take the function problem, for example.
Yeah.
Biologists constantly talk about traits having a function. Gills are for breathing, spines are for defense. You just don't hear that language in physics or chemistry.
So what does function actually mean in a biological context? Is it like a leftover from creationist ideas of purpose? How do scientists even figure out a function? It's a classic philosophical issue right there.
Or think about genetics and information. Geneticists talk about genes coding information being read, translated. But a gene is just a molecule, a DNA sequence. Is that language literal? Or just a really useful metaphor?
I see. Biologists make discoveries, but don't always stop to dissect the core concepts they're using.
Precisely. And that creates this space, this need for philosophers to come in and analyze those concepts.
Okay, and the third driver, this naturalistic turn.
Right. Traditionally, philosophers often relied on armchair methods, just pure thought, logic for big questions about, say, morality or free will. But then thinkers like Quine started arguing that empirical science should inform these debates.
And biology became key.
Especially evolutionary biology. Darwin himself famously predicted that understanding baboons would tell us more about metaphysics, the fundamental nature of reality, than studying Locke.
Wow, so how did that play out?
Well, take a concept like intentionality. Philosophers puzzle over how our thoughts can be about things in the world. My beliefs about Brazil, for instance. How does that aboutness work in a physical world?
Tricky.
But then you have philosophers like Ruth Millikan back in the 80s, proposing a Darwinian solution. She looked at the honeybees' waggle dance.
The dance they do to show where food is.
Exactly, it's a signal. Since natural selection shaped it for a specific purpose indicating food location, Millikan argued you'd see a kind of basic intentionality there. Its biological functions is to represent food location. It can even misrepresent if the bee gets it wrong.
So she tried to reduce mental representation to biological function.
Essentially, yes. Making it scientifically understandable, not some mysterious non-physical thing. A bold move to connect philosophy and biology directly.
So, summing up, philosophy of biology really emerged because 1, philosophy of science was too physics-focused, 2, biology itself generated deep conceptual puzzles, and 3, philosophy started looking to science, especially biology, for answers.
That's the gist. And Okasha's book, which we're diving into, explores exactly these themes, focusing a lot on evolution and genetics, and then, as we'll see, how it all connects to us, human behavior, mind, culture.
Okay, let's dive into the cornerstone, evolution and natural selection. Darwin, 1859, On the Origin of Species, game changer. He basically made 3 huge claims, right?
Right. First, species aren't fixed. They change over time, they adapt.
Second, common ancestry. All current species come from shared ancestors, not separate creations, a single branching tree of life.
And third, crucially, he identified natural selection as the main mechanism driving these changes.
And that was the real breakthrough. People had thought about species changing before, but they lacked a plausible how. Darwin gave us the mechanism.
Exactly. He showed how the cumulative effect of selection over vast timescales could shape organisms and even create new species.
And the logic is pretty straightforward, isn't it? 3 conditions.
Surprisingly simple, incredibly powerful. 1, you need variation. Organisms in a population can't all be identical copies.
2, this variation has to affect fitness, survival, and reproduction. Some variants just do better in a given environment.
And 3, those advantageous traits need to be heritable. Offspring have to resemble their parents, at least somewhat.
If you have those 3.
Evolution by natural selection is almost inevitable, logically follows. Traits linked to higher fitness just become more common over generations.
Darwin got the idea partly from Malthus, right? The whole struggle for existence.
Yes, reading Malthus on human populations outstripping resources sparked the insight. Darwin realized this struggle applies everywhere. More offspring are born than can possibly survive.
So any tiny advantage, a bit more speed, better camouflage makes a difference. Those individuals are more likely to survive, reproduce, pass on the advantage.
He even used the analogy of artificial selection, what human breeders do, like with dog breeds. We pick traits we like.
Nature does something similar, but unconsciously.
Exactly. Acts like a selective filter. No conscious agent needed. The result: organisms incredibly well adapted and all the amazing biodiversity we see.
And one huge consequence of this was undermining the argument from design, Paley's watchmaker idea.
Right. William Paley looked at the complexity of organisms, the eye, a desert cactus, and argued it must imply a divine designer, just like finding a watch implies a watchmaker.
But Darwin offered a natural explanation.
A purely naturalistic one. Natural selection creates the appearance of design without any actual designer involved. It's just a causal process, preserving what works best over time.
And modern biology backs this up, even for complex things like the eye. We can trace evolutionary pathways now.
It's important, though, that Darwin agreed with Paley that the apparent design is real. It needs explaining. They just fundamentally disagreed on the explanation.
And this argument isn't dead, is it? Intelligent design keeps popping up.
It does, often using scientific-sounding terms like irreducible complexity. But it's essentially Paley's argument repackaged. No serious biologist accepts it. The evidence for evolution at all levels, including cellular, is overwhelming. It's widely seen as religiously motivated, not scientific.
No, Darwin's original theory wasn't totally complete. He needed explanations for a couple of things genetics later provided.
Right, he needed a constant source of variation because selection uses it up, and he assumed inheritance offspring resembling parents, but didn't know the mechanism.
Genetics filled those gaps.
Beautifully. We know genes are passed from parents via gametes, affecting traits that's inheritance, and new variation comes from shuffling genes and sexual reproduction, and also from random, spontaneous mutations copying errors in DNA.
And these mutations are crucial. They're undirected, right? Not caused by being useful.
Exactly, they just happen. Whether they spread depends entirely on their effect on fitness.
And merging Darwin with genetics gave us neo-Darwinism.
The synthesis, yes.
Yeah.
Early 20th century. Random mutation plus natural selection equals the engine of evolution, often defining evolution simply as change in gene frequencies over time.
And they mostly rejected Lamarckian ideas acquired traits being inherited, though.
That's getting a bit more complex now.
It is. Modern biology recognizes other inherited factors, hormones, microbes living with us, learned behaviors, even epigenetic changes that affect gene activity without changing the DNA sequence itself. Ways of inheriting things beyond the simple gene model.
Okay, so the logic of Darwinian explanation is different. Lewontin's distinction, right? Transformational versus variational. Lamarck was transformational. Individuals change, grafts, stretch necks, pass it on.
Darwin is variational. The population changes because some variants survive and reproduce better than others. It's about sorting existing variation.
Lewontin's analogy. A class gets better at music. Transformational. Everyone learned. Variational. You selected for musical kids, removing others. Darwinism is variational.
So Darwinian explanations are really about populations. Why the polar bear population has a white coat, not why this specific bear does.
Exactly. Ernst Mayr called it population thinking. The population is the unit, variation is real and important, not just noise.
And this evolutionary perspective is seen as fundamental in biology. Dobzhansky's famous quote.
Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, because it provides a unique kind of explanation. Mayr distinguished proximate and ultimate questions.
Proximate is the how a mechanism works now.
Yes. How does a salmon navigate? How does a mammal control temperature? You answer by describing the immediate mechanics, odor imprinting, hypothalamus sensing temperature. It doesn't really need evolutionary history.
Ultimate is the why, the evolutionary advantage.
Precisely. Why do salmon migrate? That costly, dangerous journey. The answer isn't the how, it's the fitness benefit, maybe finding better spawning grounds. Evolution answers these ultimate why questions, explaining adaptations as sort of rational responses to the environment, but without a conscious designer.
And sometimes these connect, like in Darwinian medicine.
Great example. Standard medicine asks proximate questions. What's wrong now? Darwinian medicine adds the ultimate perspective. Why are we susceptible to certain diseases?
Like our sugar craving. Evolved when food was scarce.
But now causes obesity in our sugar-rich world. An evolutionary mismatch. Understanding our evolutionary past helps explain present health problems. Our biology is often adapted for a world we no longer live in. Despite all this evidence, evolution can be hard for people to accept. Why is that?
Well, several reasons, Akasha points out. First, it's unsettling, right? The idea you, a slug, a plant, all share ancestors. It clashes with our everyday intuition.
Second, it kind of dethrones humans, shows us as just another species, closely related to apes, challenging that sense of human exceptionalism.
And third, obviously conflicts with many religious beliefs, especially literal interpretations of creation stories. So, given the resistance, what's the really compelling evidence?
The modern idea is the one tree of life hypothesis.
Yeah.
All current life traces back to a single ancestor. And the reason to believe it is its incredible explanatory power. It makes sense of tons of facts that would otherwise be baffling coincidences.
Like anatomical similarities. The bone structure in a horse leg and a cow leg.
Makes perfect sense with a common ancestor. Makes no sense if they were created separately.
Embryology, too. Early vertebrate embryos looking almost identical.
Right. Fish. Humans very similar early on, diverging later. Fits evolution. A basic body plan laid down by a common ancestor, then modified. Why else would they be so similar at that stage? But the killer evidence, really unavailable to Darwin, is the universality of the genetic code.
The rules for translating DNA into proteins.
Yes, there are countless possible codes, chemically speaking, yet virtually all life on Earth uses the exact same one. It's an astronomical coincidence, unless we share a common ancestor. It's like finding isolated tribes worldwide who independently invented the exact same complex language. Overwhelming evidence.
So when people dismiss it as just a theory,
they're misunderstanding the scientific meaning of theory. There's a scientific theory of evolution, well-established principles explaining how it works. But the fact of evolution, supported by mountains of evidence from diverse fields, isn't really in scientific doubt. To doubt it means doubting the foundations of modern science itself.
Okay, let's shift gears to something really distinctive about biology. This concept of function and adaptation. Biologists use function all the time, don't they?
Constantly. Crab shells function for protection. Kidneys function to cleanse blood. That bird of paradise dance functions to attract mates.
But you don't hear physicists talking about the function of a planet or a glacier.
Exactly. And it's not just about what it does, because a crab shell also makes it easy to pick up, but that's not its function. A bird's dance might attract predators, but that's not its function either. There's a difference between function and mere side effect.
Which leads to a philosophical puzzle. Function seems normative, like it implies that something is supposed to do. A kidney can malfunction.
Right, it fails its job. Science usually describes what is, not what ought to be. Is biology making value judgments here? It's puzzling.
And it's tied to explaining things, right? Why do cacti have spines? For deterring herbivores. Explaining existence via function seems linked to those ultimate adaptive explanations.
It's useful to compare this with artifacts. Human-made things have functions. A sundial tells time, a keel stabilizes a boat, and those functions come from the designer's intentions.
And you see similarities. Function versus side effect, malfunction, explaining existence.
Which makes you wonder, is biological function talk just a holdover from pre-Darwinian creationist thinking?
Seems unlikely, because biologists actively debate functions today like the appendix. They're doing science, not using dead metaphors.
A better idea is that the similarity arises because natural selection acts like a designer, creating that appearance of design. So maybe function applies to things either intentionally designed or shaped by selection for a beneficial effect.
Which leads to the main philosophical theory.
The etiological theory of function, or selected effect theory. Simple idea. A trait's function is the effect for which natural selection favored it.
So the bird's dance function is attracting mates, because selection favored that effect, not attracting predators. The polar bear coat function is camouflage, because that's why it was selected.
This theory neatly handles the function-side effect distinction, explains why the trait exists, because of its past selected effect, and even explains malfunction, not producing the effect it was selected for.
But it has challenges, like which selected effect is the function? Camouflage, hunting success, avoiding starvation.
That's one issue, yes, related to the general problem of picking out the cause. Another challenge is exaptations.
Traits co-opted for new roles, like feathers.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe first for warmth, then for flight. What's the function? The theory isn't always perfectly unambiguous here, but maybe that reflects biological reality.
And it implies function is about evolutionary history. What about pre-Darwinian discoveries, like Harvey figuring out the heart pumps blood? He didn't mean selected for pumping blood.
Good point. That motivates the main rival theory, the causal role theory of function.
Which says?
A trait's function is its specific contribution, its causal role, within a larger complex biological system right now, how it helps the system operate today.
Like how parts of the immune system work together now, focusing on the proximate, how it works.
Precisely. It makes sense of how function is used in, say, medicine, without needing evolutionary history. If an organism popped into existence yesterday, its parts would still have causal roles.
But there's an objection that this theory still smuggles in design.
Yeah, the idea is that talking about a system working or having a goal, like maintaining temperature, only makes sense if it was designed or selected. So ultimately, you might still need to appeal to selection, bringing you back towards the etiological view as more fundamental.
So maybe both are valid, a pluralist view.
That's a common resolution. Both selected effect for ultimate evolutionary questions and causal role for proximate mechanistic questions are legitimate notions of function, just used for different kinds of inquiry. Why force a single definition?
And this isn't just philosophical navel-gazing. It affects real science, like the junk DNA debate.
Absolutely. Most DNA doesn't code for protein called junk. Then the ENCODE project claimed much of it does have biochemical function.
But critics pushed back.
Right. Philosophers like Ford Doolittle argued ENCODE used too broad a definition of function, essentially conflating any activity with selected function. If function means selected effect, then the junk label for much non-coding DNA might still be appropriate. Shows how philosophical definitions can really shape scientific interpretation.
Which connects to the whole adaptationist program controversy. Gould and Lewontin's big critique in '79.
Yes, they criticized what they saw as adaptationism, the tendency to assume every trait is an adaptation with a specific function, and then inventing just-so stories to explain them, often without strong evidence.
They argued adaptationists were too quick to see function everywhere.
And they gave reasons why traits might lack a specific function. First, spandrels.
Like the architectural features, byproduct.
Exactly. Biological traits might just be necessary byproducts of other adaptive traits, maybe the human chin, or even consciousness, a byproduct of large brains, not directly selected for itself.
Second, hitchhiking. A neutral trait getting a free ride because it's genetically linked to a beneficial one.
Right. It spreads not because it's useful, but because it's tied to something that is.
Third, vestigial traits. Evolutionary leftovers, like goosebumps. No current function.
An adaptationist might mistakenly invent one if they did know the history.
And fourth, developmental constraints. The way organisms develop limits the possibilities. The four-limb plan in tetrapods might just be locked in, not necessarily the best possible design.
Gould and Lewontin's message was, don't just atomize organisms into traits and assume function. Look at the integrated whole. Though in practice, biologists often do study traits in isolation quite effectively.
So it was a valuable critique of uncritical adaptationism.
Definitely. A needed corrective. Modern biologists are generally more cautious, using multiple lines of evidence to support claims about function, not just plausibility arguments.
Okay, let's tackle another huge debate. Levels of selection. The big question being, where does natural selection primarily act? Individuals, genes, groups.
It's fundamental. Life is hierarchical, right? Genes inside cells, inside organisms, inside groups, all the way up to species. And Darwinian evolution could, in theory, happen at any of these levels.
We can see it below the individual, like immune cells competing, or cancer.
That's somatic selection, yeah. Usually short-term effects within one organism. Then there's gene-level selection genes, boosting their own transmission, maybe even harming the organism. That can have long-term effects.
But the really big debate is about selection above the individual group selection. Can traits evolve because they benefit the whole group?
That's the nub of it. A decades-long controversy, especially concerning altruism.
Behaviors that cost the individual but help others, like a bee stinging and dying, or a monkey giving a warning call.
Even bacteria, releasing chemicals that help their neighbors. On the surface, it looks like a puzzle for individual selection. How can self-sacrifice evolve?
Group selection seems like an obvious answer. Groups of altruists might outcompete selfish groups.
That's the core idea. Darwin himself flirted with it, for human morality tribes with more self-sacrificing members might win out.
But the idea fell out of favor for a while, partly due to George C. Williams's critique in the '60s.
Yes, Williams' book Adaptation and Natural Selection was hugely influential. He argued against what he called loose group selection thinking, the good of the group fallacy.
Like explaining deer fighting rituals as being for the good of the species.
Williams said no. Explanations must show the advantage for the individual deer. Or an earthworm burrowing it helps the soil, sure, but it evolved because it helps the worm. Individual benefit comes first. Group benefit might just be a side effect.
He argued group selection was theoretically possible but likely weak in nature, because individuals reproduce faster than groups dissolve or form.
That was his key argument against its prevalence. Individual selection would usually win out, though interestingly, whether group selection is truly insignificant in practice is still debated today.
So if group selection wasn't the main answer for altruism, what was?
Kin selection, largely thanks to William D. Hamilton in 1964. His insight was revolutionary.
The idea that helping relatives can help your own genes.
Exactly. If altruists preferentially help relatives, who share many of the same genes, then the gene for altruism can spread, even if it costs the individual carrying it.
Hamilton's rule, RBC, relatedness times benefit must outweigh the cost.
Right. It explains so much helper birds, social insects where colony members are super related.
And it doesn't require conscious recognition. Just helping those nearby often works if you live with kin.
Often, yes. It applies to humans helping family, too. but it doesn't easily explain large-scale cooperation with non-relatives in human societies.
Now, you said kin selection and group selection, once rivals, are now seen by many as equivalent.
It's a fascinating development. Many contemporary biologists argue they're just different ways of mathematically modeling the same process. A bee stinger benefits the colony, group, but also the queen and related workers, kin. The choice of framework can be about perspective or convenience.
Shows how these debates mix empirical facts with deep conceptual issues.
Absolutely. How you frame the question matters.
Which leads us to Richard Dawkins and the gene-centric view, the selfish gene.
A really radical take. Dawkins argued the fundamental level of selection is the gene. Genes are the replicators, the things that get copied faithfully. Organisms are just vehicles or survival machines built by genes to help them replicate.
So traits benefit the genes ultimately, not the individual or group. Genes compete with their alternative versions, alleles.
That's the core idea. He defended it logically. Genes have a kind of immortality as replicators that organisms lack empirically. It explains altruism. Genes help copies of themselves and relatives, and especially things like outlaw genes.
Genes that spread even if they harm the organism.
Yes, they submit normal inheritance for their own benefit. Makes no sense from the individual's view, but perfect sense if genes are the primary competitors.
How does this fit the levels debate? Did Dawkins see it as replacing individual group selection?
Initially, yes. Later, he softened it, suggesting it's often just a different, useful perspective. You can look at it from the gene's eye view or the individual's. But those outlaw genes still pose a challenge to that simple equivalence. They really seem to demand a gene-level explanation.
Okay, this connects to another fascinating idea. Major transitions in evolution. How new levels of life emerge.
Right, Maynard Smith and Seth Mary's framework. Pivotal moments when smaller units, initially independent, team up to form larger cooperative units, creating new hierarchical levels.
Like single cells forming multi-celled organisms, or solitary individuals forming colonies.
Exactly. From genes to chromosomes, prokaryotes to eukaryotes, single cells to multicellular life, individuals to societies.
The puzzle is, why give up individuality? Why cooperate?
Kin selection is often a key explanation. Cells in your body are mostly clones, maximally related, R1 in Hamilton's rule. Cooperation is highly favored genetically.
What are the big implications of thinking about major transitions?
Huge implications. First, the biological hierarchy isn't fixed, it evolved. We need to explain how levels themselves emerge. Second, it shows that an individual organism is effectively a highly cooperative group of cells, which means group-level selection must have occurred historically to create them.
So arguing individual selection is all that matters isn't really sustainable.
Not historically, no. And it forces a rethink. If organisms are social groups of cells, then maybe concepts from social evolution apply much more broadly across all of life. It blurs the lines between individual and group in a profound way.
Right. Let's switch gears again. Classification. Science classifies things, right? Grouping similar things helps us understand and predict.
Standard scientific practice.
Right.
Physics, chemistry, biology, they all classify.
But philosophically, is there one correct way to classify? Or is it arbitrary? This really comes up in taxonomy of biological classification.
Big time. Biologists traditionally use the Linnaean system. Species, genus, family, order, etc. Hierarchical. Linnaeus himself, pre-Darwin, thought he was uncovering God's fixed plan.
But the system survived Darwin.
Largely, yes. Because evolution is usually slow, creating gaps, discontinuities between living forms today. Hamsters and mice look different.
But evolutionary theory did change how people thought about classification, leading to debates.
Huge debates. Starting around the 70s, two main issues. How do we assign organisms to species? And then how do we group species into higher categories?
Let's start with the species problem. What is a species? Sounds simple, but it's not.
Not at all. There's no single universally accepted definition. Dozens of species concepts are out there. And it has practical consequences. Biologists disagree on how many species of, say, cattle and antelope relatives actually exist.
Common sense suggests species are real things, like the philosophical idea of natural kinds. Gold is defined by its atomic number.
That's the intuition. But species aren't like chemical kinds. There's too much variation within a species, and they change over time through evolution. There's no single property all members share that defines them. DNA barcoding helps identify, but doesn't reveal the fixed essence.
Darwin himself was skeptical about species being sharply defined.
He saw species as a convenient label, arguing there was no fundamental line between a species and a mere variety.
But later biologists pushed back, arguing species are real because they're reproductively isolated.
Right. Ernst Mayr's biological species concept, BSC, became very influential. Species are groups that can interbreed naturally, but are reproductively isolated from other such groups.
That makes sense. Explains why chimps and bonobos stay distinct. Restricted gene flow keeps them separate, gives a principled boundary.
It has merits, but limitations too. It only works for sexual organisms, excluding microbes, many plants. Isolation can be incomplete, think hybrid zones, and then there are ring species.
The salamanders in California example, where populations loop around, neighbors can interbreed, but the ends of the loop can't.
Exactly. It creates a paradox for the BSC. Are they one species or two? It shows how blurry the lines can get during speciation. They're often seen as evolution in action, snapshots of species formation.
So, many concepts, none perfect. What's the takeaway?
Despite the lack of a perfect definition, the species concept is indispensable for biology. Maynard Smith's quote captures it. The taxonomist faces the contradiction between the practical necessity and the theoretical impossibility of his task. Biologists use the concept, often approximating, because they have to.
There's that intriguing philosophical idea, too. Species as individuals, not kinds, but unique entities.
Proposed by Gislin and Hull. Instead of thinking of dog like Goal, the kind, think of Canis lupus familiaris, the dog species, like Secretariat, a specific horse, an individual entity.
How does that work? Species are spread out, organisms aren't physically connected?
That's a superficial objection, they argue. Think of an ant colony, its parts aren't physically joined either. The key idea is that species, like individuals, are born, speciate, exist for a time, and die, go extinct. Kinds, like gold, aren't restricted in time and space like that.
And an organism relates to its species like a part to a whole, not a member to a kind. My cells are parts of me.
Right. This view helps reconcile the reality of species with their internal variation. Parts of an individual don't all need the same essential properties.
And this has philosophical implications. For human nature, for example.
Potentially huge ones. If Homo sapiens is an individual entity, not a natural kind defined by essential properties, then maybe there is no single essence of human nature that applies to everyone, universally and unchangingly. What it means to be human becomes about being part of this specific evolving lineage, challenges centuries of philosophical assumptions.
Okay, so once we have species, however defined, how do we group them? The dominant approach now is phylogenetic systematics or cladistics.
Yes, the core idea. Classification must reflect evolutionary history. Group species based on how recently they shared a common ancestor.
Groups must be monophyletic, including an ancestor and all of its descendants.
Exactly. Like the primates form a monophyletic group. This method groups species based on shared derived features, homologies, inherited from that common ancestor, like the bone structure in mammal limbs. It makes biological sense and offers an objective criterion. A group is either monophyletic or it isn't.
But it can lead to classifications that seem weird compared to traditional ones, like reptiles not being a valid group unless you include birds.
Correct, because birds evolved from within the reptile lineage. Excluding them makes reptilia non-monophyletic, paraphyletic technically. Cladists argue we should either abandon the group Reptilia or redefine it to include birds, reflecting the actual evolutionary history. This caused big debates with other schools of thought.
Like phonetics, based on overall similarity, or evolutionary taxonomy, a mix.
Cladists argue their method is more objective. And crucially, molecular data DNA sequencing has massively improved our ability to reconstruct evolutionary trees, phylogenies, giving cladistics a much stronger empirical foundation now. We're much more confident about relationships.
Does cladistics keep the Linnaean ranks genus family order?
It keeps the hierarchy, but argues that ranks themselves have no deep biological meaning. There's no objective reason to call one monophyletic group a family and another an order. Some argue we should ditch the ranks entirely, but that's still a minority view.
Okay, let's move to the gene. Probably the most famous concept in biology, the century of the gene.
No doubt. It's everywhere in popular culture and science news. Huntington's gene,
Golgi.
film projects.
But the basic question, what is a gene, is surprisingly tricky. Like species, no single easy answer.
Exactly. And the reasons are fascinating, tied to its history. It started with Mendel's peas in the 1860s. He proposed these abstract factors controlling traits, segregating and assorting independently.
His laws explained inheritance patterns. These factors became genes.
Right. Then classical genetics in the early 20th century, with Morgan's fruit flies, built on this. Genes were located on chromosomes linked together. They were seen as difference makers. Changing a gene changed a trait.
But crucially, these early genes were theoretical, not physical things they could see.
For a long time, yes. Morgan himself said in the 30s, it didn't matter if the gene was hypothetical or a physical particle for their experiments. It was an abstract unit of inheritance.
That changed dramatically with molecular genetics.
Completely. Identifying DNA as the genetic material, then Watson and Crick's double helix model in 1953 that provided the physical basis.
Leading to the molecular gene concept in the 60s. A gene is a DNA segment coding for a protein.
Yes, with the DNA sequence determining the protein's amino acid sequence, the sequence hypothesis, then cracking the genetic code itself, understanding transcription and translation.
And all the technology that followed sequencing, gene editing like CRISPR.
Genes went from abstract theory to concrete molecules you could manipulate.
So how did the old Mendelian gene relate to this new molecular gene? Was it simple reduction? Mendelian gene is a molecular gene.
That was the initial thought, like temperature is mean kinetic energy. Molecular genetics provides the deeper explanation.
But philosophers of biology mostly rejected that simple picture.
Largely, yes. Kitcher argued Mendel's segregation law is explained by how chromosomes behave, cytology, not the nitty-gritty molecular details. Plus, the simple bridge principle gene equals protein coding DNA is false.
Because lots of DNA doesn't code for protein, but still affects traits, like regulatory DNA.
Exactly. That non-coding DNA can still be a Mendelian difference maker. Also, concepts like dominance don't map neatly onto one single molecular mechanism. They're multiply realized. And the abstract Mendelian gene concept is still used in evolutionary models, like Dawkins' selfish gene.
So molecular biology's methods are reductionist and successful, but not every higher-level concept just reduces neatly.
That's the key distinction. It's more complex than simple replacement.
And even the molecular gene concept itself started to unravel. Post-1970s discoveries made it messier.
Significantly, leading some to talk about the dissolution of the gene concept. Gene regulation showed that control elements could be far away or affect multiple genes, blurring the boundaries of a gene.
And alternative splicing. One DNA sequence making multiple proteins.
That was a huge one. Undermines the simple one gene, one protein idea. It's incredibly common. Plus other complexities. Overlapping genes, proteins made from multiple DNA bits.
The simple picture got complicated fast.
Very. Interestingly, practicing geneticists often seem quite comfortable with this ambiguity. Conceptual precision isn't always the top priority for experimental progress.
What about the idea of genetic information? It's used everywhere, but what does it really mean?
It's pervasive but puzzling. Simplest sense. Prediction. Gene predicts trait, like clouds predict rain. But environment predicts traits too. What's special about genetic information?
Some point to the arbitrary nature of the code. The mapping between DNA codons and amino acids isn't chemically necessary, it's like a convention.
That's one argument, like the link between a word and its meaning.
John Maynard Smith suggested it's about signaling. Gene regulation involves genes signaling to each other.
Yes, where there's signaling, maybe there's information, but critics like Sarkar and Griffiths argue it's often just a metaphor masquerading as a precise concept.
And potentially harmful, leading to simplistic blueprint ideas.
That's the concern. It can obscure the fact that the genome is highly reactive to the environment, and that non-DNA changes, epigenetic marks, can also be inherited. They worry genetic information. Talk oversimplifies development and promotes genetic determinism.
Okay, finally, let's bring this philosophy to bear on ourselves. Human behavior, mind, and culture. We're clearly an unusual species.
Undeniably. Intelligence, language, culture, technology, complex societies. An alien observer would definitely notice us. Moon landings, opera, environmental destruction.
So can biology explain all this? It's a major dividing line, isn't it?
Huge divide. The biological view. We're an evolved species. Mind is an evolved organ. Behavior shaped by selection. The social science view. We've transcended biology. Behavior depends on culture, social norms.
Seems like there has to be a middle ground. Biology explains some broad tendencies. Culture explains the specifics.
That seems most plausible. Food preferences might have biological roots. The rules of cricket clearly don't. The level of description matters to broad patterns, like pair bonding versus specific marriage customs. Often complementary explanations, not either.
This gets us into the nature versus nurture debate, which is historically loaded.
Deeply loaded, often tied to nasty political agendas, eugenics, race IQ debates. Hume's warning, don't derive an ought from an is crucial here. Separate scientific findings from policy or moral judgments.
Though is science ever truly value-free?
Good question. Values can creep into descriptions or choices about what to study. Why focus on sex differences in brains without asking about their real-world significance?
How does modern biology view nature-nurture?
It clarifies things. At the individual level, asking which is more important is usually meaningless. Complex traits result from both. Think PKU, the genetic disease, needs the mutation and the dietary factor, phenylalanine. It's an interaction.
But at the population level, you can ask about the sources of variation using heritability analysis.
Right. Studying relatives like twins allows scientists to estimate how much of the difference between people in a trait, say personality IQ, within a specific population is due to genetic differences versus environmental differences. Many human behavioral cognitive traits show moderate to high heritability.
But heritability is tricky to interpret.
Very. It's population specific.
Yeah.
High heritability doesn't mean genetically fixed. Having 2 legs is genetic, but has 0 heritability in humans because there's no variation. And complex gene-environment interactions complicate the picture.
So biology clarifies the question but doesn't give a simple answer.
Precisely.
What about attempts to apply evolution directly to human social behavior, like sociobiology in the 70s?
E.O. Wilson's big synthesis tried to find adaptive explanations for things like incest taboos, avoiding birth defects, or even homosexuality, kin selection helping relatives. Hugely controversial.
Seen as reactionary, linked to eugenics by critics. But there were scientific criticisms too.
Yes. Oversimplifying gene behavior links, ignoring cognition, downplaying cultural flexibility.
Evolutionary psychology came later as its successor, with a different focus.
Generally, yes. EP seeks adaptive explanations not for behaviors directly, but for the underlying psychological mechanisms or mental modules.
The Swiss Army knife mind. Modules for language, face recognition, mate choice, detecting cheaters, adapted to our ancestral environment.
That's the idea. Leading to the evolutionary mismatch hypothesis, our Stone Age minds struggle with the modern world, hence problems like obesity from sugar cravings.
EP has its own controversies, though. Focus on sex differences, maybe too quick to assume hardwired modules. Naive adaptationism.
Those are common criticisms, yes. The extent to which these proposed modules are real and truly universal adaptations is still hotly debated.
Does any of this genetic influence on behavior threaten free will?
It's a common concern. But 2 responses. First, no one claims total genetic determinism, just influences or dispositions. Second, the philosophical problem of free will exists whether the causes are genetic or environmental. If your upbringing caused your behavior, is that less threatening to free will than your genes causing it? It's a general problem about determinism itself.
Okay, a different approach focuses on culture. Cultural evolution or dual inheritance theory.
Right. Starts by noting how rapidly human cultures differ and change, much faster than genes. Suggests we have 2 inheritance systems, genetic and cultural. We inherit beliefs, skills, norms from cultural parents.
And selection can act on this cultural variation, like farming out competing foraging.
Exactly. A kind of Darwinian process operating on culture itself. Explains rapid adaptation to local environments. Inuit building igloos, Kung hunting techniques. Cultural variants compete and spread based on their success.
It depends on our biological abilities. Learning imitation, but is somewhat autonomous, faster, can spread sideways.
Yes to all that. It doesn't need genetic change, happens quicker, information flows horizontally between individuals, not just parent to child.
And sometimes genes and culture interact, gene-culture coevolution.
The dairy farming example is classic. Cultural practice, dairying, spreads, creates selection pressure favoring a gene, lactose digestion, which then spreads biologically, reinforcing the cultural practice. A feedback loop.
Dawkins' memes fit in here. Units of cultural information replicating.
That was his idea. Memes like catchy tunes or beliefs spreading via imitation, competing for space in our minds.
Yeah.
Influential, but many cultural evolutionists find the concept too fuzzy and don't rely on it now.
How similar is cultural evolution to biological evolution? There are differences, right? Horizontal transmission, deliberate invention, Lamarckian inheritance, passing on learned skills.
Those are key differences often pointed out. The horizontal transfer happens in bacteria, and deliberate invention still leads to variants that compete Darwinian style. And Lamarckian inheritance, passing on acquired traits, while rare in biology, though epigenetics complicates this, is compatible with Darwinian principles.
And cultural evolution connects back to levels of selection, cultural group selection.
Potentially very important. Social norms, cooperation enforced by punishment, these can benefit the group. And importantly, things like migration might not break down cultural groups as easily as they do genetic groups, potentially making cultural group selection a more powerful force than genetic group selection in shaping human societies.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a lot of ground today, journeying through this landscape where biology and philosophy really meet head-on.
It's dense stuff. From the meaning of function, the definition of species, right through to what makes us human, these philosophical questions are woven right into the fabric of biology.
And this deep dive, really guided by Okasha's book, hopefully gives you, the listener, a much deeper feel for the worldview modern biology presents.
Yeah, it shows how clarifying concepts, checking the logic, thinking about the wider implications, how all that can shed light on even the most complex science. Gives you those aha moments.
So here's a final thought to mull over. If, as this deep dive suggests, you can view all life as fundamentally social, complex groups built from cooperating smaller units, how does that change how you think about your place in that grand biological hierarchy?
Or consider this. Knowing that the genetic code itself, the very basis of inheritance, is largely arbitrary, a frozen accident, not a chemical necessity, how does that shift your perception of the fundamental nature of life and existence? Something to chew on until our next deep dive.